My sister didn't introduce me at her engagement party like family. She introduced me like a warning label. She walked me across her in-laws' marble foyer with her arm hooked through mine the way you'd hold a difficult dog at a dinner party, smiling the whole time so the cameras wouldn't catch the iron in her fingers. "You have to meet Hudson's grandfather," she whispered, and her breath smelled like Prosecco and something colder. The estate sat on a bluff outside Charleston, the kind of place where the lawn ends in ocean and the silverware has a family crest older than the country. Spanish moss in the live oaks, string lights that someone had probably paid an actual lighting designer to drape. The guests were the soft-spoken kind of rich, the ones who say this old thing about a watch that costs more than my car. I had on a slate blue dress I bought at a Nordstrom rack in Atlanta, and I'd thought sitting in the dressing room 3 weeks earlier that I looked nice in it. Standing under those chandeliers, I felt like a post-it note stuck to an oil painting. My name is Mira, I'm 31. I work in agricultural water systems, which is the kind of job that makes people's eyes glaze over before I've finished the sentence, so I usually just say, I do consulting. What I actually do is build models for how water moves through farmland during drought and flood cycles. I tell almond growers when to pull off the pumps. I tell rice farmers how to flood and drain without burning out a 100-year aquifer. I tell insurance companies which orchards are about to fail and which ones will outlast the heat. I work from a converted garage in Greenville, South Carolina, with a window that looks out at my landlord's tomato plants and a 13-year-old laptop I'm too superstitious to replace. I don't have a fancy title. I don't have a LinkedIn. I have clients who find me through other clients, and I have rent that gets paid on time, and that has been enough for me for most of my adult life. My family does not consider that enough. In my family, work is something you announce. You name drop the firm. You wear the lanyard at Thanksgiving. You bring the corporate Christmas card with your face on it. My older sister Delphine has done all of this. She's a senior brand director at a media conglomerate in Atlanta, and she has been engaged for 10 months to a man named Hudson Vale, whose family owns a stretch of agricultural land and processing facilities that runs from the Carolinas down through northern Florida. Citrus, peanuts, soybeans, 3 rice operations on the coast. His grandfather, Theron Vale, is the kind of old Southern money that doesn't even register as wealth to the people who have it, because they've never had anything else. My parents have been speaking Hudson's last name like it's a prayer for almost a year. Me, they invited the way you invite the cousin who might steal something. The invitation came 2 weeks late, slipped into a follow-up text that started with, "Almost forgot. My mom called the night before to ask if I owned closed-toe shoes." Not as a question. As a reminder, I drove down from Greenville the morning of, my Civic packed with the dress, a sad little wrapped gift, and a thermos of coffee I was using to manage my anxiety. I checked into a motel 10 minutes from the estate because no one had offered me a room at the family rentals. When I walked into the foyer that evening, my mother was already by the bar, pretending to laugh at something Mrs. Vale had said. She turned when she heard my heels and gave me the once-over she's been giving me since I was 12. The one that's hunting for a flaw, finding it, and tucking it away for later. "You made it," she said. "I made it," I said. She glanced at my dress. "The lighting in here is going to be brutal in that color," she said. "You should have asked me." My dad came over, gin and tonic in hand, his hairline higher than it had been at Christmas. He kissed the air near my ear and squeezed my shoulder a little too hard. "Behave tonight," he said. "This is a big one for your sister." I said, "When have I ever not behaved?" He didn't answer. He never does. Delphine appeared a few minutes later in a champagne silk dress that probably cost more than my rent. She didn't hug me. She did this little half grab of my elbow that anyone watching would have read as sisterly. Up close, her nails were digging in. "Mir," she said, voice low and bright. "Quick favor." I waited. "Don't get into what you do tonight," she said. The Vales are very old-fashioned. They like clean, simple introductions. So if anyone asks, just say you're in environmental consulting, okay? "I'm in environmental consulting," I said. She smiled the way our mother smiles. "Right. But just say that. Don't go into the rice paddies and the water tables and the she fluttered her hand technical stuff. It makes you sound, you know." "Sound how?" She tilted her head. Like you're trying too hard. I felt that one in my sternum. Not because it was new, because it wasn't. She air kissed my cheek and floated away to greet someone in Porals. My mother caught my eye from across the room and gave me a tight thumbs up, like we were a team and I had finally agreed to play my position. Dinner was outside on a long pecan wood table under more of those string lights. I had been seated at the far end near the catering tent, between a great aunt who only spoke to her dog and an empty chair where someone's plus one hadn't shown. I ate my crab cake and listened to the laughter rolling down from the head of the table where my sister was holding court. I watched my parents lean toward the veils like sunflowers tracking the day. My dad laughed too loudly at one of Mr. Vale's jokes. My mom touched Mrs. Vale's wrist twice in the space of one anecdote. I have known this performance my whole life. It still makes me tired. After dessert, Delphine stood up, tapped a glass, and made the kind of speech that was secretly a list of her accomplishments dressed up as gratitude. She thanked Hudson's parents. She thanked Hudson's grandfather, who was sitting at the head of the table in a linen suit, hands folded, listening the way old men listen when they've already decided what they think. She thanked her own parents. She thanked her bridesmaids. She thanked, in passing, a vague and the rest of my family, which was apparently me. Then she said, "Oh, and I should introduce my little sister. She's here somewhere. Where is she?" I stood up because that was clearly the cue. 40 faces turned. Delphine waved me over with 2 fingers, and I walked the length of that pacan table, feeling each step land on a different floorboard of my childhood. When I got to her, she put her arm around my shoulders and squeezed. "This is Mira," she announced in the bright tone people use to soften an insult. "Everyone, meet our family's wild card." A few people laughed politely. "She's the one who didn't quite figure out what she wanted to do," Delphine added, smiling at me with her eyes only. "We don't really know how to describe her job, honestly. Some kind of farming thing. Anyway, she's a sweetheart." My mother, 3 seats away, said in her stage whisper, "We don't really talk about her work. It's complicated." My father chuckled and added, "She's our scenic route." The laughter that time was real, not cruel, exactly, worse than cruel, comfortable. They were all comfortable laughing at me. Even the Vale cousins I had never met smiled into their wine glasses. I felt my face heat up and then go very still. I have spent 31 years getting very still in moments like this. It's the only useful thing they ever taught me. Theron Vale had not laughed. He had been listening with his hands folded, and at some point during my sister's introduction, his head had tilted very slightly to one side, the way an old hawk tilts when it hears something in the grass. His eyes had moved to mine and stayed there. Now, in the slight pause after the laughter, he set his fork down with a small, clear sound and stood up. The table went quiet by degrees, the way a room does when an old man with money stands up unexpectedly. He looked across the table at me and said, "Your name is Mira." I said, "Yes, sir." "Mira what?" he said. "Mira Halloway," I said. Something in his face moved, not a smile. A recognition, slow and careful, like he was matching me to a memory he hadn't expected to use tonight. The corner of his mouth pulled, just slightly. "Well," he said softly, "there you are." Delphine's arm was still around my shoulders. I felt her go rigid. Hudson, sitting beside his grandfather, said, "Grandpa, you know her?" Theron Vale didn't take his eyes off me. He said, "I know the name. I have wanted to know the face for 6 years." The string lights kept swaying. Somewhere down the lawn, a child laughed. At the table, no one moved. Delphine let out a tiny laugh that sounded like a hiccup. "Well, that's funny," she said. "Mira, did you—" I shook my head once. I had no idea what he was talking about. None. Theron Vale walked around the table. He was slower than I expected, a little stiff in one knee, but his face was clear. He came to a stop in front of me, and up close I could see the burst veins in his cheeks and the gold wedding band worn thin on his finger, and the way his eyes were the same, flat blue as the ocean over his shoulder. He held out his hand. "6 years ago," he said, "my farm manager in Ridgeland forwarded me a paper. It was unsigned at first. We had to chase down who'd written it. It came from a woman doing contract work for the Regional Extension Office. A model for managing aquifer recharge during a back-to-back drought year. Saved me from losing 800 acres of rice. Saved my neighbor about the same. He shook my hand once firm. That was you. I felt the blood drain out of my face, then come back warm. I said, the Lowcountry recharge brief. He said, that's what we called it. I said, I wrote that on a Tuesday. He looked at me for a long beat and then he laughed. It was the most genuine sound at that table all night. You wrote it on a Tuesday, he said. Heaven help me. My sister's hand fell off my shoulder. My mother, 3 seats away, made a small sound like air escaping a cushion. Hudson looked at Delphine. He said, Del, you said she was like a temp. Delphine opened her mouth and closed it. Theron Vale's eyes went back to mine. The warmth in his face hadn't disappeared, but it had narrowed into something more focused. He said, Mira, would you come see me tomorrow? I have a problem you might be useful for. I said yes before I had decided to say it. He nodded once, returned to his chair, and picked up his fork like nothing had happened. The rest of dinner moved on around us. People laughed again. Conversations restarted. But something in the air had shifted, and Delphine didn't put her arm around me again for the rest of the night. She didn't quite look at me either. My mother spent the rest of the evening watching me like I had grown a second head, and she was trying to decide what species it belonged to. I drove back to my motel at 1 in the morning and sat on the bed in my dress and stared at the wall for a long time before I cried. Not from sadness, from a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. The next morning, I drove up to the estate in jeans and a clean shirt. Theron Vale met me in a small wood-paneled office at the back of the house that smelled like cedar and old paper. He poured me coffee himself. He told me he was worried about one of his operations, specifically a network of leased properties in the inland tier that fed into his processing plants. Over the past 2 years, water draws on those properties had spiked. Crop yields had not. Pumping records didn't match irrigation reports. Invoices for well maintenance had tripled. In tractors he'd never heard of were showing up in the books. His own son had told him not to worry about it. His son's name was Beckett Vale, Hudson's father, Delphine's future father-in-law. I sat in that wood-paneled office holding my coffee and feeling the shape of the thing he was describing the way you feel the shape of a bruise. Water draws too high for what's growing, wells claiming to be active that probably weren't. Maintenance invoices that, in my world, are one of the easiest places in agriculture to bury money. I had seen this before, on a smaller scale, at a couple of grow operations in the Central Valley. I knew what the data was going to look like before I'd looked at it. He said, I'd like you to take a quiet look. Independent. No one in the company knows you're doing it. I'll pay you direct. He named a number that made my throat catch. Then he said, I don't need you to be loud about it. I just need to know if I'm imagining things. I said, I won't know until I see the records. He pushed a thumb drive across the table. He said, then take a look. I drove back to Greenville with that drive in the glove compartment. I sat in my converted garage that night and opened the data and worked until 4 in the morning, and then I slept for 3 hours and worked again. By the end of the second day, the shape was there. By the end of the third, the shape had a face. The water draws on those inland properties weren't matching anything you could grow. They were claiming pump volumes consistent with a fully active row crop operation on land that satellite imagery showed was mostly fallow. The wells on paper were producing. The wells on the ground were dry, capped, or didn't exist. Maintenance was being billed for ghost equipment. The contractors getting paid were 3 LLCs registered to the same P.O. box in Savannah. The signatures approving every invoice belonged to a regional operations VP named Marsh Caudill. And Marsh Caudill, according to a 5-minute search, had been Beckett Vale's college roommate. The money was real. It just wasn't going to Wells. It was going somewhere else, and based on the timing of the transfers and a couple of cross-references I shouldn't have been able to make but did, it looked like it was being washed through a side company that supplied consulting services to the inland tier and then routed offshore. I sat in my garage with my forehead on my desk and let myself feel sick for about 10 minutes. Then I called Theron Vale. I said, I need another week to be sure, but I think your son knows. There was a long quiet on the line. Then he said, take the week. On day 4, Delphine called me. I let it ring. She called twice more. I let those ring too. On day 5, my mother called. She used the soft voice, the one that means she's about to ask for something and pretend it's about love. "Sweetheart," she said, "we heard you took some sort of job with Mr. Vale." "I'm consulting on a project," I said. "Well, isn't that wonderful?" she said, in a way that made it clear she did not yet think it was wonderful. "Look, Hudson and Delphine are in a delicate place right now with the family, whatever Mr. Colite Vale asked you to do. I'm sure it's flattering, but," and her voice softened further, "we just want to make sure you don't, blow this for your sister." I said, "Mom, what do you think I'm doing?" She said, "I don't know what you're doing. That's why I'm calling." I said, "I'm doing my job." There was a pause. My father came on the line. He must have been standing right there. "Mira," he said, in the voice he uses when he wants to remind me he's the dad, "you can have this. You have a chance to be useful to this family for once. Don't get cute. Whatever you find, you bring it to your sister and Hudson first. Let them manage it." I almost laughed. I said, "You don't even know what I'm finding." He said, "I know enough." I said, "You don't, actually." He said, "Mira." I said, "You don't, actually." He said, "Mira." I said, "I have to go." I hung up. I sat in my garage and looked at the spreadsheet of fake wells, and I thought about the version of me at 14 who would have done what he asked. I thought about her for a long time. Then I went back to work. On day 6, Delphine drove up from Atlanta and showed up at my garage at 9 in the evening. She had never been to my place before. She stood on the gravel in heels she shouldn't have been wearing on gravel and looked at the tomato plants and at my screen door like both were beneath her. "We need to talk," she said. I let her in. She did not sit down. She looked around at my desk and my monitors and my whiteboard covered in equations and a hand-drawn map of the Edisto Basin, and I watched her try to fit this version of me into the version she had told her fiancé about. She said, "What are you doing for Theron?" I said, "That's between me and him." She said, "Mira, Hudson's father is involved in something. I don't know exactly what. Hudson doesn't know exactly what. But we know it's bad and we know it's about to be your problem because you're the one looking." I said, "It's already my problem." She said, "Then you need to be careful how you write it up." I said, "Careful how?" She said, "You know how. You write it in a way that flags the irregularities without naming Beckett. You make it look like Marsh did it. Marsh leaves. Beckett pays Marsh off. The family stays intact. The wedding happens. No one's life explodes." I said, "No one's life explodes." I said, "No one's life except Marsh's." She said, "Marsh is a grown man who took a paycheck for years to do this. Marsh will be fine." I said, "Marsh didn't move the money offshore. Beckett did. I can show you the wire trail." She closed her eyes for a second, then she opened them. She said, "Mira, please. I am asking you as your sister. Soften this." I said, "You're asking me as your sister now." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "You introduced me at your engagement party as the family wild card. You let our parents call me a scenic route in front of 40 people I'd never met, and now you drove 4 hours to my house to remind me we're family." Her jaw tightened. She said, "That was a joke." I said, "It was a performance. You needed those people to laugh at me so they wouldn't look too closely at you. I get it. I've been getting it my whole life. I'm done with it." She said, "You're being dramatic." I said, "Am I?" She said, "You're being dramatic." I said, "Am I?" She said, "You've always needed to feel like the smart one. You've always needed to be the secret genius nobody recognized. Well, congratulations, Mira. Theron Vale recognized you. You have your moment. Now don't burn down my life with it." I looked at her for a long time. She is 2 years older than me. We used to share a bathroom and a hairbrush and a small irrational fear of the dark. She used to braid my hair before school because our mother didn't have the patience. There was a version of her when she was 9 and I was 7 who once punched a boy on a playground for making fun of my front teeth. I have loved that version of her my entire life. I have kept her alive in my head long past the point of evidence. I said, "Delphine, your father-in-law is stealing from a man who trusts him. He's stealing from a man who, in case it matters to you, has been kinder to me in 6 days than our actual father has been in 31 years. I'm not going to lie for him. I'm not going to soften it. I'm not going to write it in a way that makes a scapegoat out of Marsh so the Vales can keep their dinner parties clean. I'm going to write what's true. You can be at the wedding, or you cannot be at the wedding. That's between you and Hudson and your conscience. But you don't get to come into my house and ask me to be small again. I'm done being small. She stared at me. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. Delphine never cries in front of me. It's the one rule she's never broken. She said, "If you do this, you're not my sister anymore." I said, "I haven't been your sister in a long time. You just hadn't noticed." She left. The screen door slapped twice behind her. I worked through the night. I wrote the report. I attached the evidence. I cross-referenced the wells with the satellite imagery and the pump telemetry and the tax filings and the LLC registrations and the wire transfers, and I built a clean, walkable narrative that any forensic accountant could follow. I sent it to Theron Vale at 6 in the morning. He called me at 6:15. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." He said, "All right." He flew his outside auditors in that afternoon. He did not call his son. He called his lawyer, his board, and the state ad commissioner he had known for 40 years. By the end of the week, Beckett Vale was on administrative leave pending investigation. Marsh Kudiel had retained counsel. 2 of the Shell LLCs had been frozen. A federal investigation was opened the following month. None of this was on the news because that kind of family knows how to keep that kind of thing out of the news for a while. But it was happening. The engagement was not called off. Hudson, to his credit, sat down with Delphine and told her he didn't want a wedding, shadowed by his father's prosecution. They agreed to wait a year. My mother told me in a voicemail I did not return that I had ruined my sister's life. My father told me in a separate voicemail that I had embarrassed the family. Neither of them mentioned the part where someone had been stealing from an old man who trusted his own son. Theron Bale called me 2 weeks after I sent the report. He said he wanted to offer me a job, Director of Agricultural Risk and Resource Management, full salary, signing bonus, the kind of title my mother would have framed. I said no. He said, "May I ask why?" I said, "With respect, sir, if I work for you, I become someone who works for the Vales. And right now I'm someone who works for the land. Those aren't always the same thing." He was quiet for a second. Then he laughed, that same real laugh from the dinner table. He said, "Mira Holloway, I'd like to hire you on contract then. As often as you'll let me, with no exclusivity. Would that suit you better?" I said yes to that. We've worked together on 3 projects since. I still live in the converted garage in Greenville. I bought a new laptop. I kept the old one on the shelf because I'm sentimental and I'm working on it. My sister married Hudson a year and a half later in a much smaller ceremony at a vineyard outside Asheville. I was not invited. I did not expect to be. I sent a card with a check inside because that's what I would have done if we were the family I sometimes wish we'd been. The check was cashed. The card was not acknowledged. My parents and I are in a kind of détente. They call on birthdays. I answer. We talk about the weather. They have never said the word sorry, and I have stopped waiting for it, and I have stopped waiting for it, and I think that's the closest thing to peace we're going to get. Sometimes I drive past the road that leads to the Vale estate. I never turn down it. I just notice it. I notice the live oaks and the moss and the way the light comes in low over the water in the late afternoon. I remember standing in those string lights in my Nordstrom rack dress, feeling like a post-it note in a museum, and I remember walking the length of that pecan table with my chin up, and I remember the way Theron Vale set his fork down and said, "Well, there you are. There I was. There I am." If there's a lesson in any of this, and I'm not the kind of person who likes lessons, but if there is one, it's that the people who decide you're nothing have made a math error. They've added wrong. They've left things out of the equation on purpose because the answer they wanted required it. You don't have to argue with them. You don't have to explain. You just have to keep being the thing they refuse to count. Sooner or later, somebody at the table will set down a fork and look at you and finally do the math right. And when that happens, you don't even have to smile. You just stand up. I've thought a lot, in the years since that night under those string lights, about why it took someone else recognizing me from my own family to finally look up from their plates. And the honest answer is that they were never going to. They had decided who I was when I was small and quiet, and that decision was useful to them, and useful things are the hardest to give up. My sister Delphine didn't humiliate me at her engagement party because she hated me. She did it because she needed the room to laugh at me so it wouldn't look too closely at her. My parents didn't call me their scenic route because they thought it was funny. They said it because saying it out loud was the only way they knew how to keep their version of the family standing. The math only worked if I stayed small. The second I refused to stay small, the equation collapsed, and a lot of other things collapsed with it. That wasn't cruelty on my part, that was just gravity finally catching up. Here's what I've come to believe: the work you do when no one is watching is the only work that's actually yours. The paper I wrote on a Tuesday in a converted garage with no signature and no expectation sat in Theron Vale's inbox for 6 years before it ever paid me $1. But it was still real on Tuesday. It was real the whole time. The recognition was just timing. The worth was already there. I think a lot of people are waiting for someone to stand up at their table. I understand that. I waited too, for a very long time. But I want to tell you something I had to learn the slow, ugly way. If you wait to be recognized before you let yourself be real, you'll spend your whole life in the corner seat. The recognition, when it comes, and sometimes it does come, is just an outside witness to a fact that was always true. You don't owe the people who underestimated you a softer version of yourself once you've outgrown them. You don't owe them the version that makes their lives easier. You don't owe them the comfortable lie that lets them keep believing they were right. What you owe yourself is the discipline to keep building, in the dark, with no audience, because it matters to you that the work is honest. What you owe yourself is the steadiness to keep your chin up when the laughter starts, because lowering it teaches the room that the laughter was earned. And what you owe yourself when somebody finally does set their fork down and look at you is the courage to stop apologizing for taking up the space you were always entitled to. I don't carry anger about my family anymore. I carry something quieter and more durable. I know what I'm capable of. I know what I've done. I know whose trust I've earned. The people who refused to count me weren't wrong about me. They were just wrong about the math. And the math, in the end, doesn't care who's at the head of the table. It only cares what's true.